Good evening, and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal, Discoveries from the Dark, the radio show and podcast where we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan, sometimes even across Canada, to see what lies within. I'm your host, Katie Kulpa. I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher based here in Regina. In fact, my debut novel, which is a supernatural horror, releases on September 17th. So if you're interested in learning more about my book, Coma, make sure you look me up on any social media platform to find out more. Today, we're going to return to a topic that had me kind of falling down the hypothetical rabbit hole the last time we chatted about it. And that is, where did our interest in the paranormal, including interest in ghost hunting, investigations, debunking, paranormal technology, even talking with the dead, where did that all start? So tonight, our focus will be turning to the start of seances, which of course led to the increase in investigations and into debunking paranormal hoaxes and fakes, as well as the appearance of ectoplasm into the world of psychical research. So, turn down the lights, sit back, and join me as we go back to the turn of the 19th century. So the last time we spoke about this particular topic, we had left off talking about Thomas Hamilton. So if you recall, he founded the Winnipeg Society for Psychic Research back in 1931. This was after a few years of him being involved kind of in the psychic research because he developed this fascination with the spiritualist movement shortly after his 3-year-old son passed away in 1919. He investigated kind of all of the typical psychical phenomena of the time, whether it was automatic writing, table tipping, trances, and as I said, even the appearance of ectoplasm. Yes, we're not in a Ghostbuster movie here. They actually had attempts at studying ectoplasm back then. But let's go back to kind of the beginning of seances. So this was right at the beginning of the spiritualist movement in the 1800s. And it seems to have all started with actually 3 sisters in 1848. So at the time, the 2 younger sisters were living in Hydesville, New York with their parents. And their names were Maggie and Kate Fox. So there seems to be different versions of exactly how it all started, but the overall theme kind of has the same idea. Apparently, the family had moved into this small house in Hydesville in 1847 and quickly started to claim that the house was haunted. Now, some say that the taps and knockings in the house started right away and plagued them for the full year and, was leading to the family being unable to sleep, unable to determine what was causing these noises. And then others say that it actually all started, in 1848 with the 2 younger girls, Maggie and Kate, claiming that they could talk to a ghost in the house through knocks. And when their mother, excitedly invited the neighbors over to see what their 2 girls could do, it really started to get attention from the neighbors and the people of nearby towns. And during one of these occurrences that the neighbors were in the house, Maggie, who was 14 years old at the time, and her younger sister Kate, who was 11, apparently had managed through these knocks and taps to discover that the house was being haunted by a peddler that had been murdered and buried underneath the house. Although again, there's some mixed ways of how this actually went. Some say under the house, some say within the walls, some say underneath the floorboards. So I don't know which is actually accurate, but you get the idea. Now, they did have an older sister, Leah, and she had already moved out of the house. She was already living in Rochester, away from the family. And although she wasn't entirely convinced of this newfound talent that her younger sisters seemed to have, she did see an opportunity for her family. Her family at the time, it was, rough living. They were going through some financial hardship. And in Rochester, where she was living, there was a lot of overcrowding and bad conditions, which were typical of cities of that time. And it was led to this epidemic of illnesses and death. So people in Rochester, as well as other cities, were losing a lot of family members and were really interested in this idea that they could potentially talk with their deceased loved ones again. So, seeing this opportunity, even though she didn't really believe her sisters, Leah had her sisters moved to live with her in Rochester in 1849. Now, the events following again are a little all over the map, depending on which article you read, but some say that Leah had, the two sisters charging an admission to hold seances in their home right away. Some say that actually local community leaders, Isaac and Amy Post, were actually the first to invite them to a gathering in their home to, to have a seance and have all these people show up. But what is agreed upon in all of the articles that I read is that the two girls eventually did perform their first official act, I guess you would call it, in front of a large gathering of people. I think they said up to 400 people, or maybe it was 400 people. And this took place in the Corinthian Hall in Rochester on November 14th, 1849. And this ended up being really the start of their fame, and because they would continue to hold many more seances and shows for many years following. Like, this became their livelihood. And they would travel to different cities. Even Leah apparently became a medium herself. And because, this became so popular, of course, many more mediums started coming out and holding seances of their own. So hence the rise of the spiritualist movement. Now, this is where the story begins to turn. Because apparently, under the control of their oldest sister, Leah, and her insistence on continuing to make money off this talent, Maggie and Kate, began to drink heavily. They began to get really depressed, even though they had both married, they had both had children. At least I think they both did. This eventually led to them, also just admitting that the entire thing was a hoax that their sister Leah insisted on them keeping up with. Now, apparently, this sudden admission to guilt was followed by Leah actually trying to gain back control. Apparently, she was worried that, the drinking that her two sisters were involved in were going to ruin them, was going to stop the money coming in. So she had threatened Kate that if she didn't stop drinking and straighten out, she was going to have her children taken away. But whatever the cause, Kate and Maggie did admit that they had been faking the conversations with the dead simply by cracking the joints of their toes against furniture and walls to make the sounds. Now, what many people speculate about this particular admission to guilt is that it was in front of a large crowd in October 1888, so like 40 years later, and Kate had been paid $1,500 at the time to make this claim. So some people were like, really? Do we believe it? Or was she, wanting the money or being forced to do it? And within a year, Kate retracted it and said, yes, she had been forced to do it and that she didn't, it wasn't actually a hoax. They actually did do it. So realistically, it's hard to say. She went right back into being a medium again until the time of her death. Of course, by the time she had said it had all been a hoax, there were already many mediums working and doing seances across the country, probably even across the world, because as we know, Canada, we had our own kind of versions of it. So the spiritualist movement wasn't going to be largely impacted by her statement regardless, even if that was the hope. And another claim was that eventually, like in the early 1900s, someone did tear down the home and actually found bones under the house of the Foxes, which would have gone along with their original ghost story of the peddler being buried under the house. So maybe they really did talk to a ghost, but became tired of the attention, or maybe they were just really tired of Leah, controlling their lives. It's hard to say for sure with all of the different versions of the story and it being so long ago. But what is obvious from the story is that the world was changing. Women no longer needed to fear death through accusation of witchcraft, because the girls actually were accused of witchcraft, but they weren't put on, a trial. They weren't killed. And people in general were becoming much more interested in what happened after death. The spiritualist movement was not going to slow down, but unfortunately, neither was the increase in the desire to uncover the frauds and hoaxes, and neither was the increases in hoaxes for that matter. So, in case you have never heard of a seance, let's kind of just discuss what this used to involve first. I know that paranormal television shows nowadays like to claim them as, oh, they were evil, or likely the start of hauntings, or, bringing in someone evil. But that wasn't actually, the point of doing seances back then. Back then, they were actually really considered a way to converse with your deceased loved one, to be able to get a message to them, or hear how they're doing, or make sure that they are okay. A group of people would typically sit at a circular table, and a medium would be sitting with them, and they would all hold hands. Now, why people like to claim they were hoaxes and fakes is because the lights would either have to be turned off completely, or it would have to be really, really dim in the room. Supposedly, ghosts could not communicate with the living if the lights were on. I know, with what we now know of hoaxes and fakes, it's easy to see that this shapes up to a very easy way to fool people into believing they're talking with a ghost. However, this was something that particularly the higher classes enjoyed doing. So they would, have parties and have people come over to their homes and have a seance, inviting their friends and neighbors. And this is just what you would do. So there were many ways that communication could be had with these deceased loved ones in these circles. And it would kind of depend on the medium, probably very similar to today. Some would focus on automatic writing, something that is still used today by mediums. And others would use the Ouija board, trance speaking. So, going into a trance and being able to channel the ghost. Or, there might be a bell or some sort of mechanism on the table in front of the medium that would make a noise or move during the seance. And this would be how the ghost would be communicating with you at the time. Now, it should also be noted that at the same time that the spiritualist movement and, this increase in seances and mediums and conversing with the dead, there was also an increasing demand for illusionists and magicians. So it was during this time that actually Houdini rose in popularity. And although he at first supported the spiritualist movement, or at least he said he did, not all people believe him, he would later become one of the biggest activists against it. In fact, even shortly before his death, he was involved in an attempt to criminalize fortune-telling for hire to put mediums out of business. He also had developed a brand new act that exposed the tricks of many mediums on stage, and he even later turned that into a Broadway show. So he was really against mediums. He felt that you should not have to pay to speak to your dead loved ones, and that was a hoax, and that you were bothering people that were down and out, and you shouldn't do this. So he was really against it. And this fight between the mediums and spiritualists and Houdini himself even led to rumors that maybe they were the cause of his death, because he died on Halloween Day in 1926 at the age of 52. Now, the death certificate does indicate a ruptured appendix, but of course, people speculate that maybe he was poisoned or something else had caused the ruptured appendix by the spiritualists. Now, Houdini wasn't the only one that was working hard to find the fakes that were taking money from mourning people. As we discussed in the previous episode regarding the history of the paranormal, many scientists were forming psychical research labs and departments to consider whether communication with the dead and paranormal manifestations, like the ectoplasm, which we'll talk about in a minute, could actually be real. So this was around the first time that, the first devices were starting to be used in attempts to capture evidence. And that included, like we talked about, I think last time, was adding cameras all set up into seance rooms in an attempt to capture, picture evidence or visual evidence of ectoplasm or of things moving, and that the medium wasn't moving when it was happening. So whether that evidence was to prove the medium was real or fake, it's hard to say. Some of the attempts to achieving proof weren't exactly ethical either. At times, scientists would bring in mediums that claimed, hey, they could be in a trance and channel someone from the other realms while they're conversing with the dead or whatever. And scientists would actually inflict pain. So the argument was, well, if you're actually in a trance and, and we burn you or potentially leave a permanent scar to you, you shouldn't come out of the trance if it's real. And if you do come out of the trance to scream that, you're in pain, well, then you're a fake. Like, really, I don't understand how this was considered an ethical way of doing things, but I guess back then a lot of things weren't. So Houdini was one that would even come up with some contraptions, so in an attempt to prove the mediums were fake. And now there was one medium that did seem to be able to outwit him, or at least he was unable to find a way to prove that she was a fake. And she went by simply Marjorie. So Marjorie, also known as Mina Crandon, was born in 1888 and grew up on a farm in Ontario. Now, another Canadian, hey? So when she became a young woman, she actually moved to Boston and she became a secretary of a local church. By 1924, she was already kind of, diving into being a medium and doing seances of her own. And her name was submitted to a call for anyone that could prove telekinetic ability to a Scientific American magazine group. Apparently, prior to this call by the magazine, Mina had been doing some seances already with her husband because he was just fascinated with the spiritualist movement. He was fascinated with the topic of being able to converse with the dead. So he would take her to seances, and eventually she would say that she was hearing from her deceased brother, Walter. And so she started to work as a medium and tried to start channeling him. So Mina, or Marjorie, would undergo actually a lot of investigations by many scientists, including Houdini himself, in attempts to label her as a fraud. Now, many of the investigations were either inconclusive or even favorable that her abilities were real. And by the Scientific American magazine, because she had submitted herself to be, part of this, if she could prove that she was really telekinetic, then they would give her a sum of money. She could win a prize. So while undergoing the investigations with them, which included Houdini in some cases, they would have her do various different things. They would hold both of her hands and have whoever's holding her hands also put their feet across her feet to make sure that she wasn't using, her feet to ring a bell or doing anything else with other parts of her body. And in one in particular, when Houdini was there, he actually created a cupboard. So it was like a cupboard that the medium or that Marjorie would sit in, and only her head and arms were exposed. So Houdini would sit on one side to hold one hand, and one of the other scientists would sit on the other side to hold the other hand. And it was said to prove that she was using her feet to ring a bell that was on the table, or, make something move. And at one time, this led to her brother actually supposedly getting angry that his ability to communicate through his sister was fake, and he violently moved the cabinet with Marjorie in it. There are a couple different variations of the story. In one, it states that the cabinet was forcibly moved around the room with Marjorie in it. In another one, it was that the cabinet exploded and was broken, exploded open. The lock was broken or something to allow Marjorie to be free. Another time, a bell was placed inside the box with Marjorie while her hands were being held on the outside, and they asked Walter, the spirit, to ring the bell. Then Walter, speaking through Marjorie, and apparently his voice actually came, she was able to change her voice, or he came through with his voice. But anyway, he claimed that the bell had been tampered with by Houdini himself. And then when they released her to check the bell, they did in fact find that a damper had been put on the inside of the bell to prevent it from making any noise. And this was kind of the start of Houdini being labeled as someone that would stop at nothing to expose a medium as a fake, even tampering with evidence, which didn't look very well for him. And I think there was even one more that had something to do with a ruler, but I can't remember exactly what the story was. But Marjorie had to go through actually 90 different investigations. That's 90, with just the Scientific American Journal alone. to try and get that prize. And in the end, although they couldn't prove that Mina was fake, they said there was not sufficient evidence that her talents were real and refused to give her the prize money at all. So she even underwent many more investigations. I think she did get paid by some of them at least, by various other psychical researchers following that. Apparently even our Winnipeg psychical researcher that we discussed the last time, the Thomas that we talked about earlier, he even had Mina come to Manitoba to sit in his seance room in his home so that he could study her. He would witness her abilities a total of 11 times, 8 of which he would travel to her, where she was, twice in his own seance lab within Winnipeg, and once at the home of one of his acquaintances. He was convinced actually that her abilities were real and that she wasn't faking her ability to connect with her dead brother Walter. And this is where we'll lead into the ectoplasm phenomenon, as Marjorie is one of the famous cases of it. Supposedly, her ectoplasm started just as kind of dark matter that would emit from her nose, ears, perhaps mouth, but they could never get the material after. But eventually it became much more elaborate. Her actual brother's hand, supposedly, would form as ectoplasm on the table. Although from the pictures, you could see that it came from up inside her skirt, which led to many allegations about how she was faking this particular manifestation. But we won't get into that here. Especially given her husband was a doctor, and he would frequently want to be involved in the circle and insist that he had to sit beside her, and for some reason that is when the hand would show up, so there was speculation that they were in it together. But on one occasion, in an attempt to prove that this hand was fake, they had it actually put its fingers onto some material so that they could get a fingerprint. At first, they couldn't find anyone with that fingerprint, so they thought, hey, maybe it actually is real, like maybe it is her brother's. But then someone thought to check with some others that had been in the room at different times, and here it was her dentist's fingerprint. It was a perfect match. So in that case, they did conclusively indicate that Marjorie had faked it. Other occurrences of ectoplasm were not so elaborate, but they were still under investigation for a very long time. Other mediums claim to have the ability to suddenly have material form from their nose, their mouths, their ears, out of their sleeve, out from under their skirt. And you should see some of the images. In fact, I'll be sharing some of them on my website where I share what I find in the research for the show. And so you can check it out there. But yeah, just looking at the pictures, you can tell the material is like cheesecloth or something, or a towel, or just something. And some of them even have images glued inside them, like a person's face, to make it look like a face materialized. Apparently the mediums were really good at having the material just disappear before the end of the seance. So the people couldn't actually touch the material. Although apparently the material was had a really bad odor, like a body odor. And Houdini claimed that the mediums were able to swallow these materials and regurgitate them at will, that they had, practiced that to make sure that they could do it, which would explain why they would smell bad, in my opinion. But eventually, with the rise of these investigations by scientists, especially with the ones with pictures and things and, really having a controlled environment, they were able to capture some of the material and study it, and leading to the exposure of this was a hoax. Like a lot of times it was cheesecloth or a towel or something like that. And as we all know, in the field of paranormal and supernatural, hoaxes are not surprising. When you're in a field that is difficult to prove, especially one that is now considered a big ticket entertainment field across television, streaming sites, YouTube, I don't know, it's hard to know what really to believe. There are many big paranormal and supernatural occurrences now even labeled as fakes that used to be, really believed in. Things like the Amityville house, which has many versions in books and movies nowadays. The Loch Ness Monster has come out as a fake. The Cottingley fairies, the pictures of fairies from back in the 1920s, I think it was. So with the increase in a desire to reach a viral video or post nowadays, I feel like fakes and hoaxes are likely only going to increase. That's probably also why even the Vatican recently announced that they're, making it stricter on who can label an apparition or an occurrence as something, holy or supernatural. So now only popes are allowed to make those claims. Not even the bishops can do it anymore. So I don't know. It's hard to say. But what do you think? Do you think that most of the paranormal today are hoaxes and fakes? Or do you think there's some actual truth to some of these claims? Personally, I think that some of the investigations that are going on today, especially with the newest technology, they might actually be capturing something that we don't understand. But are they necessarily ghosts? It's hard to say. Perhaps we're communicating with other realms or planes. Perhaps there are aliens trying to reach out. It is a big universe, so who knows? Or maybe there's something else that we just simply don't understand yet or haven't experienced yet, and so we just don't know where it's coming from. However, I do still personally watch the television shows for what they are meant to be, entertainment. I don't think of them as being true investigations of the unknown. In my own experience and in discussions with people that do these investigations, it can be difficult to get any real evidence during a 2-hour investigation or even a 4-hour even a one-night investigation, let's be honest. Sometimes the ghosts just don't want to cooperate and only seem to show themselves in between takes or when everyone has gone home. Now, this doesn't stop the elaborative reactions to minor bumps or the increase in hoaxes. And I imagine with the increasing use of AI, we're only going to see an increased number of fakes. So although I do believe in ghosts and I do believe in supernatural phenomena and things that we just can't explain, I will remain a skeptic of many of the supposed evidence unless I can experience it for myself. I think that's all the time we have today to be talking about this particular segment of the history of our paranormal. So thank you for joining us tonight. Don't forget, if you'd like to support the show, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. I also have a Patreon for those that want behind-the-scenes information, extra content, and a chance to join a live Q&A with me each month. Next week, we will be traveling to Prince Edward Island to talk about another mystery. Now, this particular mystery occurred back in 1908 off the coast of Bay Fortune. So let me know if you know what that's about. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlights handy and digital recorders ready. This is Katie Kulpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.